So let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about some of the basics of using Jupyter Notebooks to actually code and some of the basics of Python. Just getting used to the usual conventions of coding, things like keeping your code in different cells or debugging or keeping variables constant. We'll talk a little bit more about using data libraries, creating your own data members, seeing those data members by using print functions, and then manipulating large sets of data using operators. Maybe sounds a little more intimidating than it actually is. So let's go ahead and get started and open up a kernel here in Jupyter Notebooks. So first things first, let's import a library that we're going to be using, the NumPy library as np. So what we're doing is importing the NumPy library, and then when we use it, we'll be using the syntax np. We'll come back and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second, but for now, let's just go ahead and run that cell. So whenever you're creating a data member or setting something equal to a number, a letter, a string, this is kind of the syntax that you'll use. So say, for example, I want A to represent the letter 1. This would be how I would do it. If I want A to represent the string hi, this would be how I would do it. Or the character A, this is how I would do it. We don't need to worry about typing our variables. If, for example, you've coded in another language, you're used to doing something like this or like this. But we don't need to worry about doing that in Python. The compiler types it for us. So for now, let's set this equal to the integer 5. Let's create a second data member with the integer 25. And we'll go ahead and run that cell using Shift-Enter. So now, here in this next cell, let's talk about the print function. Print function, very straightforward, just print followed by the parentheses, and then inside of that, whatever it is that you want to print out. So in this case, the variable A prints out 5, the same as if I were to just type in a 5 there. The difference is that it's good practice to use a variable and then change the value of the variable up at the top. Because let's say, for example, I have several print functions here. Then all I need to do is change my variable in one place rather than going through and changing it in every single place that it appears. So that's just good practice, makes your life a lot easier to do something like that. So now that we kind of understand the print function, let's talk about manipulating these variables using operators. So the operators, if you've ever used any kind of online calculator, you'll be used to them. We'll see an asterisk to multiply. We will see create another data member here. Again, just good practice. There we go. Now we can see that this value wasn't coming up correctly for my variables here. I have the number 5 and 25, and when you multiply those by each other, that is not equal to 50. Now what our issue is, and something that will probably happen to you quite a bit, is previously I had the number 2 here, and I had not run this previous cell. So now if I run it, and then run this one, I'll end up with 125. So make sure, if you're having weird bugs, just kind of come up here to your kernel and restart and run all. Kind of a good rule of thumb, it'll go ahead and restart and run all of your kernels. That way, if you've changed a data member or something like that, the compiler will recognize it. So another key aspect is I was able to recognize that problem because I had these in 2 separate cells. That's another good coding practice. Just keep your cells separate. Code in small blocks. So I define my library up here in this cell, define my variables, set them equal to values, and then manipulate them here using operators and then a print function. So let's talk just a little bit about a data member called a list, and then we're going to go ahead and use this library that we imported. So a list is just any set of variables separated by a comma. So I had the list 4, 5, 6 and the list 1, 2, 3. Now lists we can see when we print it out. We see 4, 5, 6 here, or if we were to change that to B, which is useful. But let's say, for example, we're trying to manipulate the actual numbers themselves there in the data set, which we'll be doing quite a bit here in this class. A list isn't necessarily the best way to do that, because if I want to take my entire data set, 1, 2, 3, then multiply it by the integer 2, this is what I'm going to end up getting if I use a list, which is not exactly what I want. So what instead we're going to do, we'll create a third variable here, and then use the numpy function np.array. So using the syntax for the numpy library that I defined here, np, calling a function from that library by using dot, the function name is array, parentheses, and then in these parentheses I put what's called a parameter, or the input to the array function. In this case, the list A. Let's go ahead and run this cell. And then that allows us to multiply our original array by 2. So that's just kind of a basic overview of some of the data members, using a library, creating a list or an array from a list, and then manipulating that. The one thing that's going to be just a little bit different here in the operators that might catch you off guard, let's say I want to take my list here that I've then turned into an array and square it. You might be used to using the caret here, which isn't going to be the right function. Instead, what we want to do is double asterisk, and that'll give us the right values. So other than that, feel free to kind of tinker with different operators, using different variables. Go back and watch the video again to kind of get used to some things. But spend a little bit of time coding here in the Jupyter notebooks, and just remember some of the basic conventions that we talked about. For example, keeping our cells separate, just so that if we have a problem somewhere, we can find it a little bit easier. Using variables rather than hard coding in our numbers. So things like that. But other than that, that's kind of a good start on the basic tutorial of Python. So go ahead and get started on your projects.